Hello, and welcome to 52 Weeks of Health Equity with Conscious by Us. I'm your host, Tahisha. Imagine a world where everyone lives their healthiest version of life. What would that look like? At Conscious by Us, we believe health impacts all aspects of our lives, especially our progress towards creating a diverse and inclusive world where everyone feels they belong. The other interesting thing about health, not only does it impact all aspects of our lives, but it is in turn impacted by all the things we have going on in our lives. In healthcare, we call this the social determinants of health. Really, it's five big areas, and those areas are economic stability, our ability to get work and jobs, access to quality education, and the key there is quality healthcare. Can you get it? Can you access it? The neighborhood and environment that you exist in and impacts your life, and your social and community standing, which is often impacted by your identity. It's this interdependent relationship, the two working together, that create the healthiest version of you. So, with that in mind, I decided I wanted to have 52 conversations about health equity with a variety of guests across a multitude of areas, industries, and subjects. On today's episode, I am so excited to have the incredibly brilliant Femily. Femily is the founder and executive director of the American Association of Corporate Gender Strategists, where she leads the premier think tank for DEI researchers, consultants, and chief diversity officers. I have also heard you referred to as Silicone Valley's gender inclusion advisor. And on a personal note, I am just a huge admirer of you. I follow you. I go to whatever you show up at. So I would love if you can share just a little bit more about yourself because I love you and I'm sure our listeners are going to love you too.
Oh, Tahisha, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. It was a very easy yes. I'm trying to keep my mental health in check, and that means keeping a spacious calendar. So I don't always say yes. But it was a very easy yes to say that I would come on here. I love what you're up to. The 52 weeks of health equity it's so rich, and I'm very into the topic. I have healthcare clients, so yes, I'm Silicon Valley's gender and inclusion advisor, and I also help healthcare companies sometimes. As my client, I have two big ones right now and two smaller ones, and I help. So I'm thinking about your topic through the lens of how I'm helping those clients serve their patients better, and then I'm also thinking about it through the work that I do with all kinds of companies to make sure that the folks who are working within there have, equal access to the money. I mean, you spoke about the social determinants of health, right? The equal access to the money. I help them make sure that their healthcare plans are inclusive, and generally, what we're thinking about these days is trans inclusion. And then also, we do a lot of thinking about the sort of identity confidence angle that you talked about last time. So that's my work. And then the last thing that I do outside of what you mentioned, the association, is I run an incubator for queer, trans, and feminist people called Future Thought Leader, where they can do exactly what you're doing right now, which is get their voices out there into so it's marginalized people speaking out about issues that affect marginalized people, because the microphones about health equity, about everything, have too long been pointed just at the whiter, more male, more straight people. And so we can never fix all of the problems that are going on in healthcare or the world if we are not hearing from all of the voices who are experiencing the worst brunt of the broken systems that we're talking about.
Yeah, and that is so important. And it's such an important issue to talk about because, as you mentioned, a lot of the voices tend to sit in certain spaces.
Mhm.
And what really resonated with me and how I found you initially was that you were a voice talking about that issue, that we needed to hear from more thought leaders. And how could we have access to those thought leaders getting to express their ideas? Because I know sometimes you feel like you're just yelling into a
Right.
void, right? Like nobody
Mhm.
hears you.
Right.
You're yelling into a void. And I love that you've taken your access to platforms and your privilege and shared that, which is, something that not a lot of leaders in spaces do.
Yeah, thank you. And when you're talking about that right now, it's making me remember how we have reclaimed the word thought leader, right? It used to be when you thought about it, you would think about the ones who the establishment had already said, you should be at the head of our canon, whether it's healthcare or literature or politics or whatever. And so we're reclaiming that, and sharing that if you have a different perspective than is already out there, your perspective is needed. And so we give the tools to the people in the program to be able to go forward, even if they haven't been handed the sort of the canon, right? The visibility that other people have been given. And so I did that because I wanted that to happen to me, right? I was sort of muscling through into visibility. I do have public relations training. And so I do use that public relations training and try to give away those secrets to the people in my program. But it is true that it's always so hidden as to how people make it into, whether it's on a panel at a conference or into any of the books on your shelf behind you, or into the doc when you watch a great documentary and the talking heads are in there talking about this community or that community. Like, I have things to say about those communities. I know my friends and my colleagues and the people that I meet who are not on the panels yet have things to say about those. That's who I want to hear.
Yeah, and you really just touched on something that is so important. Like, how do we get those voices out there, right?
Yeah.
So, and as far as health goes, when we think about equity, we're talking about, promoting voices that don't have equity right now.
Yeah.
So it can be difficult to get a variety of people talking about healthcare,
Yeah.
or health issues that
Mm-hmm.
are concerning to people who don't get to speak. Now, I want to just ask you this question.
Yeah.
When you think about your program,
Yeah.
or the work that you've done in
Yeah.
this area, what are some things that jump out at you that are just you're super proud of
Yeah.
seeing people kind of explode onto those thought leader platforms? Because I know
Yeah.
you've helped lift many
Yeah.
current speakers into that area.
Yeah, I mean, I'm smiling right now because everything you say on here helps me draw connections that I hadn't necessarily drawn before. So I'm loving this conversation, and I appreciate the way that your questions really get me to think differently. I'm just doing a meta moment right here. In other podcasts, it's sometimes just regurgitating old stuff. So I appreciate what is happening here. Um, what first came to mind when you asked that question was about how when I went into these healthcare companies, and then I'll tell you about individuals who have really skyrocketed. But when I first went into healthcare companies, their focus on quote unquote patient experience was like, let's do a survey. How do they like it? Do they like their doctor? Do they feel comfortable? Very important questions. But they were not splicing that data by language of origin, race, gender orientation. So in general, if the general average was like, yeah, we totally feel respected by our doctors, but for example, if every queer person didn't, right? And that's only 10% of the population or something, then the 90% who are like, yeah, we're pretty good with our doctor, that would blur out the results from the queer community. So it's also about the queer and trans community listening to the data by splicing it in the right way so that you can lift the voices who are trying to tell you something, but they're in the numeric minority and are not getting the megaphone in that kind of way, right?
And I love that you said that because when you think about the people who actually will fill out a survey, There is a percentage that just throws it away,
True.
right? So when I was taking statistics in my master's program, I remember the professor saying, and I want you to remember that the people who actually send these surveys in are another segment of the population who either want to praise you or want to tell you what you did wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So we often miss that middle group that doesn't even send it in. That was like,
Right.
yeah, I have nothing to talk about. So
Yes.
I'm not even going to fill this out.
Yes. And there's also this whole other, there's a couple other communities that come to mind. There's the communities who, you know, the language of the survey, the English language of the survey isn't their 100% most polished language ever. And so they're like, you know, it takes extra time. I don't have time to do this, you know, so you're missing people because this, if the survey's not, you know, in their easiest language. And then also people who have never, whose communities haven't really been told, we want your input and we're going to do something about it. So if communities have been turned off from, who no longer believe that a health establishment is going to listen to them, then they might also just have given up and not be filling out the survey. So you have to do extra layers of research, like uh, focus groups, where it's not my white self going in there and talking to a community of color, for example. It's someone from that exact community going in and talking to them and saying, what do you think would work here? What isn't working for you?
Yeah, that is so important because many times we see these surveys or these focus groups and they're run by people who don't represent the community or look like the community.
Yeah.
So it's hard to talk about things that you may be uncomfortable talking about
Oh, yeah.
with someone who may not have shared any of those experiences. A colleague was telling me about how they were doing some surveying and she looked around and she realized we're surveying a Black community and I'm the only person who is Black involved in this project, which
Yeah.
is, everybody else is, white centered.
Yep.
So, how does that impact your results or the truth that people tell you? Maybe I'm fearful and I don't want to share things.
Right.
So, I love that you recognize that and point that out to companies
Right.
because there is this thought that, okay, I'm hearing the voices. You may not be hearing the voices because they're afraid to share
Yeah.
with you because they don't trust you. The Black
Right.
community is a big one when it comes to healthcare and
Yep.
trust and whether or not they trust the healthcare system. Because if you look at mortality rates, they have not
Mm-hmm.
really been. I know they're working harder on some of these issues, but they have not pushed the needle as far as they need to go
Right.
with recognizing the harm that can be done when we don't talk about, the data that we're basing some of our work on.
Right.
So,
Or
yeah.
even creating, or even having enough available Black physicians or Black mental health providers, right? If you can't find someone that looks like you might be less willing to share your truth with them.
150 million%, I agree with this. And I agree that resonated with me so much because this past year I spent and I'm in the healthcare
Yeah.
field, so I have some contacts in there.
Yeah.
I spent about 6 months trying to get my son a Black identified therapist,
Yes.
and I could not find one in this local area. I was only able to find like some pieces of that.
Yep.
Um, and there is a huge difference between speaking with someone who can understand some of your challenges. I
Mhm.
finally was able to find someone who was Black identified, happened to be a woman. I was looking for a man,
Yeah.
but this is like the first time he's ever connected with a therapist. He's had 3 other therapists before
Yeah.
and was about to give up on therapy and said like, hey, you know what? I think I get it. I think I
Yeah.
get why people talk to therapists. He was like, for the
Oh,
first time, I'm being honest and I'm being sharing, and I think it's helping me. And it was like how do we get more people into that pipeline? Because like it's
yes.
so needed. And that's why I love what you do, because part of what the social determinants are is the
Right.
economic piece, the work piece,
Mm.
the environment
Mhm.
piece. So
Mhm.
how do you even get people to think about going to school for this if they don't see like mentors in the healthcare
Exactly.
space
I know.
who can help them through the process?
I know, you're
So
making me think of my friend Dr. Bedford Palmer, he's a psychologist, and he created a center. He's Black. He created a center called Deeper Than Color. and it was just him at the beginning, and it's slowly grown. I mean, fast. It's grown fast because there's such a need for therapists of color, especially Black therapists. And so he has a whole organization in Oakland that's filled to the brims with therapists who are serving filled to the brims roster of clients, and they just keep growing. Yeah, I mean, it's clearly a need. And so healthcare companies, I use that as an example when my healthcare clients are like, well, maybe there's no more people of color who would be coming to this place. And it's like, as soon as you have people on the inside who look like the kinds of people in the community where you're located, then you will have them coming through the door, unless there's some other extreme barriers, which we can also get rid of.
Yeah, you are just spitting truths with us because I know I look and sometimes I'm like, well, this is a stock image and this is a
Oh,
stock image. And I've seen this
yeah,
other places. I know this does not represent your actual team. And then
right,
you go to the team and you're like, oh, there's no woman, there's no
right,
person of color of any ethnic background
right.
on the team.
Yeah,
Will they really get what I'm talking about when I start talking about things? And that
exactly.
doesn't even add in like neural diversity, right? Like
Right.
that's just like facial diversity.
Right.
So, we haven't even gotten into deeper conversations,
Right.
which you get into in
Mm-hmm.
all of your thought leadership and all of your conversations around trying to promote this idea of let's really dive deep into what does it look like to be inclusive
Right.
um, from multiple aspects. So I just want to also like kind of you mentioned barriers. What do you think are the
Yeah.
biggest barriers that you have seen out there that prevent people from either speaking their truth
Yep.
about thought leadership or
Mm-hmm.
discussing healthcare issues or going inside internally in their healthcare organizations or companies period and
Yeah.
saying, "Hey, you guys need help."
Yeah. Oh gosh, that's so many different branches. I'll start with the one, what stops people from being thought leaders? First of all, with every degree of marginalization you have from a well-connected white bro who got a Stanford degree, right? Every degree, right? A straight and neurotypical, et cetera, right? Every degree from that is another way in which the world is telling you you're not meant to be on this stage. We don't need your story. Your story is not the one that looks like the pages of Fast Company or Chronicle of Higher Ed or the New York Times or NBC News, et cetera. And so it's the personal, it's the thing that stops people is looking at the truth that most of the business books and the health books and the podcasts, et cetera, that have been famous and started so far look like people who don't look like them, right? Look like people with more power and privilege. And so we flip that in Future Thought Leader and we say, yeah, that is what most of them are, meaning that's oversaturated. There's a huge gap in the market for ideas and thoughts and perspectives from alternative views, right? From views that haven't been played over again and again, right? To hear from communities, especially intersectional communities, right, on how they interface with the healthcare system, what would make it better, how they felt at this point in history, how they want to be eating and loving and making friends and earning a living and creating family, right? Um, this is a wide open territory. So that's the number one reason people think it's already been done and it doesn't look like me.
Yeah, and I love that you mentioned like this is a huge territory that is not accessed, that we're not diving deeper into. And for companies, organizations, like this
Yeah.
is an untapped market
Yes.
because the truth is soon, and this might be a newsflash to the white current majority, but
Mhm.
soon
Yeah.
the majority will look more diverse. It will be people of color.
Right.
It will be more diverse thoughts. And so, if you look at Generation Z,
Yeah.
they are the most diverse generation we have, and they are very open to different concepts and ideas around gender, sexuality. And if we don't start preparing ourselves, and I sit in Generation X, for
Mhm.
what is that going to look like? Because the other thing we often forget is the generations above the Generation Z and millennials have a huge power. They're holding on to a lot of power,
Right.
and they may not be the true voice of who actually is sitting in large spaces. So Generation Z is very big. They're bigger than Generation X.
Mhm.
And combined with millennials who tend to have similar thoughts,
Mhm.
maybe not 100%,
Mhm.
if you look at that whole segment, like that's a huge community you are missing out on and not serving
Right.
because you're looking at, hey, Generation X and baby boomers
Mhm.
who I was one of like, I think in my high school, which was predominantly white when I moved there from a inner city area, I was one of like 7 people of color
Okay.
in my high school class,
Mhm.
and our voices were not heard at all.
No. Let me guess, it's kind of like totally unheard, but then also you were very much under lots of gazes at once, right?
Yes, yes, the gaze of, "I'm sure you play sports, I'm sure
Yeah.
you can dance, I'm
Yeah.
sure you're a good singer."
Mhm.
All of those
Mhm.
stereotypes that I wasn't good
Yeah.
at any of those things.
Right.
So you're under a heavy focus, and
Yep.
then you're also, you don't get to say anything about what that focus looks like.
Right.
But the groups that are coming up now,
Yes.
they're very diverse looking, so
Yep.
we can't lean into what has been the okay practice. And I think we're feeling that conflict with a lot of the political legislation coming out, which
Mhm.
is a direct sort of like, ooh, I don't like being challenged.
Yeah. And guess what's challenging? To get people's voices out there in more ways than have been out there. And what I'm always encouraging my participants to think about is like, we talk about the microphone as an analogy, but it doesn't have to be like you're actually doing a TED talk on a stage. I mean, most people are afraid of talking on a stage. So it's really just an analogy for getting your voice out there. And so some people are getting their voices out there in crunching spreadsheets that fuel a movement, that get a movement super organized. And so then the movement is going, right? The point here is moving the needle in terms of change. It's not getting more people. It's getting some people on stage, and some people should be on stage, but it's also having people who want to work behind the scenes, right? It's very introvert friendly. So maybe you're more of the type who curates an anthology of other people who you consider experts on the intersection of healthcare and rurality, healthcare and economics, or the working class, et cetera. Healthcare and race, gender, and orientation all in one, for example. You don't have to step forward and say, I am the expert here. That takes a lot of pushing back against social norms that marginalized people are told. But to be able to do behind the scenes things, such as there was a young person in my program who wanted to do something about climate change, and she was like, I'm 4 years into my career and I'm very passionate, so I'm going to create an organization that brings together people of color interested in climate change who've been doing work, at least 10 years more than I have, to bring their ideas to the table. I'm going to lead from behind, or set the table for them, basically, so that these conversations can be had. So there's so many ways to get marginalized voices out there, and it doesn't have to be like you're the person in the microphone.
Yeah, and I would even say like the person in the microphone is probably the least important person because they're drawing
Yeah.
from all these other experts who are writing content, who are creating those white papers, the
Mhm.
data that a lot of what is talked about is based on.
Mhm.
So, and I was going to ask you this question. I was like, what can listeners do? And
Yeah.
you just jumped in there and you were like, you don't have to be on stage.
No.
You can also do the background
Yeah.
stuff, which most change happens grassroots. It's the
Yes.
people who knock on doors, right? And they're
Yes.
not on a microphone.
Right.
So I love that. What other things can they do besides just like the friendliness of like building the data piece of what can
Yeah.
listeners really kind of like engage in? If I wanted to engage in something really actively after this
Yeah.
podcast, what can I do or how can I support what you do?
So start super close to home. It can be so overwhelming to be like, oh, how do I stop climate change? How can I get universal healthcare to happen right now, or whatever, something enormous. But how can you, there's someone in Los Angeles who is handing out I guess the proper name for these is like feminine hygiene products, tampons and pads, right? In Los Angeles, to people who are experiencing homelessness, right? So that is a you know, a problem where you can stem the tide of pain for a moment for this very specific community in conjunction with the community, and be doing good, right? It's a band-aid solution, but we need people focused on band-aid solutions until we get these overarching solutions put in, right? And so pick one. There's enough that needs to be done out there, uh, that you can pick something that really energizes you. If stirring soup to feed people who don't have enough meals is something that makes you, for me, I don't like it. I eat a vegan vegetarian diet. I don't like stirring a meat soup and putting it over into someone's bowl. To me, that's not where I shine. I have for many years done graphic design for small nonprofits because I really just love sitting at my computer. I'm also more of an introvert. So sitting at my computer, cranking out beautiful graphic designs for organizations like that really didn't have that in-house. And so I would do that for free. So there's enough to be done out there that you can absolutely move the needle, change the world without having to go outside of your extreme comfort zone.
And so I really love the fact that you talked about like comfort zone, because
Yeah.
a lot of introverts don't
Yes.
want to do the active volunteer piece,
Right.
but then think like, I have nothing to give if I have to go outside and interact with
Yeah.
people. And what does that look like for me? And then you mentioned doing the graphic
Yeah.
design. Like that is something so simple
Yes.
that we don't think about for these nonprofits who might not have the funding, especially small
Right.
grassroots. Like that could look like an animal shelter too,
Totally.
that maybe you just love cats and
Right.
you want to improve how
Yeah.
they, advertise stuff.
Yep.
So I love that you mentioned there's these simple, small ways in your comfort zone that you can really start to make change
Right.
using your skills.
Yep.
And so I'm sure many people listening have skills they would love to share.
Yeah.
And I don't think I've ever heard of an organization that turns down volunteers who are willing to volunteer their time to help an
Yep.
organization grow and blossom.
Yep.
We are actually coming up to the end of our segment, and like this just blew by so fast, right? we like what, because it's such a interesting topic and you have so much to share. How can our listeners find out more about you? I'm going to have some stuff in the speakers,
Yeah.
not the speakers, in their podcast notes,
Yeah.
on how to reach out to you.
Yeah.
But what's a great site to follow you on, or a great way to connect with you?
I mean, I honestly love meeting with people on Instagram because it's
Family's Instagram is awesome, by the way.
oh, thank you. I feel very free on there to go hard on my political opinions and my social causes, and it's very fun for me there. I don't feel very reined in, and so I really love that. And then I also would encourage you to think to yourself, what's the kind of thing people always ask you about? So if people are always asking you about, like, hey, I know that you have a queer kid, like, can I pick your brain? When they say pick your brain, can I pick your brain for a little bit about it? Because, my kid just came out to me, or I'm trying to navigate this system, or I'm trying to, figure out how to go vegan, or I'm trying to figure out how to give my teacher anti-racist resources, and I know you did it. Whatever people know you did and are good at and they want your advice about, do more of that. Like, this whole becoming a thought leader doesn't have to be more complicated than that. It doesn't have to be you take 400 classes and then finally you can write an article. It's like, what do people
Oh my
today
gosh.
need your advice on?
At the end, you touched on something so important. We all sit here waiting till we're sort of ready
Yeah.
for the show, right? Like, oh, I don't know enough. I need to read
Yeah.
more. I need to do more.
Yeah.
And that is probably the worst thing we do to ourselves. We're constantly
Yeah.
waiting for someone to be like,
Yeah.
hey,
Yes.
you are a expert or whatever.
Right.
Don't even be an expert. Put your
Mm-mm.
voice out there
A
in a
voice.
positive way. Get some knowledge.
Right.
But you don't have to wait till you have have like this
No.
body of stuff behind you. And I love
Absolutely
that you
not.
said come from the place where people ask you, because people see you as an expert and you don't
Yeah.
even realize it.
Yeah.
So
And you just
that
have to
was
be an expert
beautiful.
2 breaths more wise than the person asking the question. You just have to be enough to lead them along a couple steps towards where you are. They're not asking you to be the intense psychologist of everything about the topic. They're just wondering, "Hey, how'd you get through this? How'd you get through that kind of grief? How did you navigate that system?" A few tips, not the Encyclopedia Britannica of everything possibly connected to that before you can talk.
Yes. So thank you so much for being on the podcast today. I really, really, really appreciate you. I could talk to you for hours and hours about this stuff, and you are a plethora of information. I'm going to have some stuff, like I said, in our notes, how to reach out to Femily, how to sign up for programs that are coming soon. And I appreciate you so much. Thank you for being on.
I appreciate you doing what you're doing. The visibility to social determinants of health is so extremely important right now. Just, I cherish your work. I cherish you as a human. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.